Okay, seems to be working.
I think we need to pull it down at your nose.
How's that? Is that better?
That's good. Patty, can you hear that okay?
If I'm speaking, can you hear me? Yes, I can. That's good. That's good.
We'll check it with mine. That one's going okay. And then if you just push that top button there, that will mute it. if you want to stick the mic on. Yeah, I know. We've been out of rhythm. We took a break for Christmas in January, so sort of like, okay, let's start back up. And folks are sort of like, oh, it's not on my calendar. So, oh, well, thank you, Natalie, for reminding everyone, and appreciate that. Yeah. And folks who are joining via 966, welcome. Glad to have you here, both also via YouTube. We're glad to start back our faith conversations for this next sort of semester installment. So we are glad to have Julie Stoneberg, who is the interim pastor at Unitarian Universalist West here in Brookfield. There on North Avenue. She is interim and been here for 6 months.
6 months.
But looking forward to the conversation where we explore what is Unitarian Universalist, where did it come from, and if we were to sort of drop in, what would things look like? How would it feel to be at a Unitarian Universalist service? Turn it up a little bit. Okay, we will turn the volume up. See if that gets us a little bit better. And if we're still having problems, just give me that, and I will go ahead and turn the volume up. So, Julie, welcome. Glad to have you here. And I'd like to start our conversation by asking you to tell me a little bit about what you think are the primary shared beliefs that folks in the Unitarian Universalist tradition have, knowing that there's a wide range. So how would you end up describing sort of that primary shared belief?
Well, the first thing I would say is that it's the wrong question for Unitarian Universalists.
Okay.
That we don't have shared beliefs. We have shared values, but we don't have a creed. We're a non-creedal religion. And so the question of what we each believe is really difficult to answer. But that said, there's lots of similarities in the way that people see the world, see their faith. So we are at an evolving faith, like many faiths are, and I don't know that much about the history of Presbyterianism, but there are often changes in what your statements of faith are, or, oh, that's a bad thing. I'll just hang up on her, sorry. What your statements of faith are, and that's a big process when that happens, when there's changes. And we're right now in the middle of that change for us, but we are a faith that is guided by a set of principles. There are 8 of them right now, and the bylaws require that we look at them every 15 years, and we're right in the middle of that. And I hope there's going to be some big change, because times change, language needs to change, understandings of the world need to change. But they are things like the individual's right to search for truth and meaning on their own, the inherent worth and dignity of every individual, support for one another in our spiritual growth and path, whatever that might be, the use of democratic processes in our decision-making, justice, equity, and inclusion in the world community, the interdependent web of existence and how we all rely on one another. And the 8th one that's been added most recently is around our commitment to being an anti-racist faith and searching search for and really striving toward the beloved community as envisioned by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King.
So I'm hearing sort of these principles and these values, and tell me a little bit more about how, I'm switching up off of questions. So tell me a little bit more about how those are embodied at Unitarian Universalist West. How are some of those principles embodied in that particular congregation? Because they're sort of nebulous, but if you could give us some concrete examples.
Hmm. Well, let's say, for example, the individual search for truth and meaning. We offer a lot of adult and children's religious exploration and education programs, and we affirm a person's right to follow the path of their conscience and their heart. And so things aren't presented as didactic and here's the truth, but rather as here's what other people do. Here's what we might learn from prophetic people in history. Here's what world religions might teach us. So where does that take you? You know, so allowing people to perhaps in language that is used widely, listen for that still small voice within, to listen to their heart's calling, to listen to the voice of God in whatever way it might be speaking to them, as opposed to an outside source or authority saying this is what you must believe or this is what's true. Does that answers an example of how one of the principles. So one other principle is this, world community of love and justice that calls us to act for that in the world. And so social justice is a big part of our programming and activities.
So one of the things that I'm curious about is sort of the development and emergence of the Unitarian Universalist tradition, because I know that it has some origins in New England and that, some of the Enlightenment kind of, more the, I'll let you jump in because I'm
Okay.
probably messing some stuff up there. Transcendental, that was the
Transcendentalism, yes,
Yes.
absolutely. Depends on how far you want to go back. So we are a tradition that comes out of the Reformation, but it wasn't, further back than that, it comes out of different philosophies or thinkings about the world. So universalism as a philosophy is about the belief that all are saved, that God is a loving God and would not punish anyone in that way. And Unitarianism is the belief in one God, or it was initially, and both of those philosophical, theological positions were part of the early Christian debates and conversations about what the truth might be. So we could go back there, but often our root of history goes back to Michael Servetus and the heirs of the Trinity and Unitarianism in Poland and Transylvania, where there was a king in the 1500s who said that there could be no law that said what anyone had to believe, that people should believe in their own conscience. And so we have strong connection with Unitarian congregations in Romania and Transylvania and Poland even today. But in this country, so that's Unitarianism. Universalism has stronger roots probably in England, but it was really brought to these shores and this continent, with early settlers. And so Unitarianism formed eventually as an association of congregations in 1825. Universalism formed earlier than that in the 1700s. And as two very liberal ends of the Christian spectrum at that time, they developed associations and collaborations and ultimately became merged as one faith tradition in 1961. So therefore, the Unitarian Universalism, the merger of those two faiths.
And so what I'm definitely hearing you outline is Unitarian Universalist has very strong Christian roots. However, my understanding is at this point, Unitarian Universalists wouldn't necessarily classify themselves as Christian.
Right.
So tell me a little bit more about that move away from identifying as Christian, and how does Christianity as maybe a mother religion still stick there for UUs?
Sure, just as a little bit of foundation or back piece, currently, our faith is expressed, as I said, in these principles, but also in a list of sources, which essentially are kind of a bullet point list of all the places people might find their source of inspiration. And it's everything from personal experience to science and nature to the world religions, but specifically mentions our Jewish and Christian heritage. So that is part of our faith, but it's one part of our faith. So I'm not a historian, and so I'm not going to be able to give you all the details of the evolution of Unitarian and Universalism in this country, but what I will say is that part of the foundational pieces of our faith is the sense of, as I've said, this individual sense for truth and meaning, which sometimes is expressed as the right of conscience and freedom to believe what you must believe, not what you want to believe, but what you must believe based on what your heart and your conscience calls you to believe, which requires study, exploration, commitment, all of those things. So I would say primarily beginning in the early 1800s, folks began, as globalism started to happen, folks began to be influenced by the rest of the world. Understanding, coming into contact with people who identified as Hindu, or people who identified as Jewish, or people who identified as Muslim, and understanding, oh, there's this whole other tree of the way people see the world. And that, along with the fact that several of the early transcendentalists in the United States were Unitarian, this being Emerson, Thoreau, Margaret Fuller, that list of early transcendentalists who had this sense of they're not having a need for an intercessor, that each person should be able to divine for themselves the presence of the holy or the sacred, and that they could have that personal experience without any in-between, and without anything in between them and that direct experience. And that, I think, began the movement away from Christianity. And of course, there's a whole lot of actual physical church history in that many of the first Unitarian congregations were the church on the public square. I think 3 of the first 5 presidents of the US were Unitarian. This was very much the religion of the colonialists. And that move away from Christianity split Unitarians from what is now thought is now the Congregationalists. And those actual churches had, their interior battles about their faith, their creeds, their doctrines, whatever, and eventually moved away from Christianity. And that's really when Unitarians got their name as Unitarians, because in that battle, they became the dirty word, those Unitarians. They don't believe the way we do. And so I think it's that expansiveness of open thought and freedom to think for oneself that led Unitarian Universalism now to be inclusive of more than. Does that kind of answer your question?
I really do think that does, that there's this idea of, as you encounter different ways of experiencing spiritualism, encounters, that you find yourself open to more possibilities. And so, okay, we started here, and it's okay to grow and change and allow for different expressions. And so one of the things that raises a question mark in my mind is, if there is this wide openness to different views and expressions, how do you navigate in a particular congregation the divergent views and divergent ways of being, because sometimes that can cause points of conflict. Sometimes it can provide points of clarity and revelation. But how do you navigate that diversity of views that's present within the Unitarian Universalist tradition?
Yes, I agree that when there's differences of belief and perspective, that's the place where there are rubs and where there are divergent views and where there's possibilities for conflict. And I think that within our faith, we have a built-in commitment to tolerance, acceptance, trying to understand the other. And so, one of the things I often say within a congregation is, if you don't like something that's happening in a service or you don't believe what's being said, look around and appreciate the fact that for someone else in this room, that's exactly what they need to hear today. And maybe it's not for you today in this moment, but it can't be all for you all the time. That in a pluralistic kind of environment, we have to be accepting of, embracing of difference. And so that's part of the spiritual path, is that understanding of difference. But it is hard for us as humans to not want to be right and to feel like, well, there's others who believe differently than me, so therefore I must be wrong. And it's not about right and wrong. It's about where your true north is, where you find your lodestar, where your guide is. Yeah.
And so how are congregations able to navigate those differences when there might be divergent views of what should happen or how this congregation should move forward, if there aren't some guiding, you've talked about guiding principles, but if there isn't some shared understandings that help to provide the foundation?
Well, I don't think we have any special way through that not every community deals with. I mean, it's not as if there aren't differences of opinions and people who over time haven't come to think, well, this is the way this is, and this is what I like, and therefore everyone else should like that and want it that way. And so some of the differences are generational. Some of them can be cultural in terms of different, what's the right word? The way in which society is leaning, and so there's just different perspectives on things. And we have to navigate them the way anybody navigates them. I guess from my point of view, it's about talking to one another, listening, trying to understand, creating the space for people to speak in a way that they're respected and heard. I don't know that there's any special...
Well, and I don't want to say, well, Unitarians must have it harder because you don't have any guiding principles. I mean, one of my favorite sayings is, wherever 2 or 3 Presbyterians are gathered, there's at least 4 opinions. And so the way that, one of the things is having to live with that diversity, that the differences of opinion, I think, could be really interesting and help you provide insight for us.
Yeah, I think one of the ways I would frame that is that if, in fact, diversity, inclusion, pluralism is a central focus of our faith, then that's where we find beauty, or we can find beauty. That's where we can see where a limited opinion or limited set of opinions limits us and doesn't allow us to engage with the full diversity of life and belief and experience, to be able to see that our way is only one way of doing that. And so I think, again, that's one of the spiritual paths of Unitarian Universalism, is seeing that diversity as the beautiful thing, not the thing to be scared of, and also recognize that there are so many gifts in it for us as individuals. I don't mean us as Unitarian Universalists. I mean all of us. That's why I love seasons. It's wonderful to have differences. Yeah.
So we've been talking a bit about how Unitarian Universalist has its roots in Christianity, but doesn't consider itself Christian in definition. And so I understand that there is a weekly worship service, a time to gather as a community.
Mhm.
If I was to show up
Mhm.
at one of those services, tell me, what would it look like? What would it feel like? What might be the rhythm of that gathering?
Well, one thing I would want to say, and this might be true of your faith tradition as well, is that no two churches are alike. And no two of our congregations would, there are many who would not call themselves a church. And so you can't really say that it's going to be this way in any Unitarian Universalist congregation that you walk into. In my experience, most of the time you'll experience something that would be similar in format to a Christian service. We definitely come out of the Protestant tradition. So, people are sitting together in a room, sometimes in rows, sometimes in circles, People, there's opening words. In our case, we light a chalice, a flaming chalice, which I could talk about if you're interested, is the centerpiece of our faith. We light a chalice. Congregation lights a unity candle or whatever it might, might be in your tradition. We sing songs. We have a hymnal. We have special music. We have readings. They might be from a scripture, not necessarily the Bible. In fact, kind of rarely the Bible, but they might be from the Bible. It might be from some other scripture, from some other holy text. It might be a contemporary poem. It might be a reading from a magazine that is pertinent to something that we're talking about. And there is typically a sermon or message of some kind. What's different is that I think the language is different. It's not typical for there to be things that are repeated every week. Maybe more informal in some congregations anyway than in some religious traditions. So, but I think it would feel both familiar and different. Yeah.
So tell me a bit about the chalice and sort of that centering point for.
So you see on this thing, that little symbol that says love above it, that's a way to symbolize the chalice. Historically, it comes out of the chalice is something that's part of our history because of the rejection of the chalice only being reserved for the priests and the insistence on the common cup. So that's something that's in the Radical Reformation and many traditions. So that's where the chalice comes from. The flame, I suppose, we can talk about it in a lot of different ways in terms of what the flame and light symbolize, and candles, of course, that's a pretty ubiquitous thing. But the actual symbolism comes out of World War II and the Unitarians' very deep involvement in getting people across the borders that they needed to get across to survive. And there was a person who designed a logo, like our flaming chalice, that was to symbolize that this was a safe organization, that this came from this organization that people could trust to help them find ways to escape. And then it just grew into the symbol of the faith. And then I think what I've read is that in about the 1960s, the mid-60s, maybe even into the early 70s, it started to become a very common ritual in our traditions to light a chalice whenever we gather. And it just kind of grew and has become, sort of this very center symbolism of the faith, and interpreted in many ways. Often we say, the warmth of community, the light of truth, and the fire of commitment, this kind of sense of of how and why we gather. Yeah.
So in Christian traditions, there's often sort of seasons that focus what the sort of theme is present for the worship service. So, in a few weeks here, we're going to be coming up on the season of Lent, which focuses more on repentance and turning again to God. How do you focus some of your services? Because you're saying that, well, we might choose this reading or that reading. How do you make those decisions when things can be so wide open?
Sure. I studied we have 2 seminaries in the States, but I studied at a ecumenical seminary, and I used to feel like in preaching class where we were given often the lectionary readings to preach on, well, this is really easy. You just get to have this reading and they tell you what to talk about. And of course, it's not. I don't mean that it's harder or anything for us, but we do have a pretty open calendar. And the minister of a congregation or the worship team of the congregation has a very primary role in deciding what the focus is going to be. There certainly are cycles in the worship calendar that can be based on the seasons. Our service last Sunday was a celebration of Imbolc. We have a strong group of people in our congregation, in this particular congregation, who study and are very interested in and consider themselves, they have earth-centered worship. And so Imbolc is a pagan celebration of the time of the seeds. This time of the seeds starting to sprout. And that was our service for this last Sunday. So there are those things that come into being. There are often social justice things. So we always, in most congregations, would speak would focus on Martin Luther King Sunday or on Black History Month, on things, as I say, things having to do with the seasons, things having to do with holidays. Of course, there are traditions around other faiths. Since we look at the world religions, we will have an Easter service. We have a Christmas Eve service. We have in many congregations, you'd have a service that would at least try to understand better Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah from the Jewish tradition. And so there are things in the calendar that inform what we might choose. In recent years, maybe for the last 15 years, there's a habit, I would say, or a possibility in Unitarian Universalist traditions to follow themes, often themes of the Spirit. So that's what this congregation and my former congregation did, was to use these guided, not unlike a lectionary, but a guided packet of information around a certain theme. So, for example, January, our theme was the path of finding our center. And starting in February, it's the path of love. So we do that, and then that will guide, where services are going. And certainly, things that are happening in the world matter. I think it was Theodore Parker, who's a Unitarian Universalist minister from the 1800s, who talked about how you had to preach with the Bible in one hand and your newspaper in the other. And I think that's really, that's true for Unitarian Universalists, that what's happening in our world really matters in terms of what we're talking about.
And a Swiss Reformed theologian also said something similar. Karl Barth said that you need to preach with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other as well. And so that shared tradition of making sure that faith relates to what is being lived and what's being experienced in the here and now is crucial. So you touched a little bit about you went to a interdenominational or a ecumenical seminary. Tell me a little bit more about the preparation, because for most Christians, there's sort of this, go to seminary, go through a few processes with committees, making sure that yes, you're called, and then what kind of preparation is involved to be a minister in the Unitarian Universalist tradition?
Well, we use the language of call as well. So, a person's call story, in what way they've felt called, is a big part of what leads someone to become a minister. The first person I talked to about the fact that I felt I was feeling a call essentially said to me, the only reason that you should become a minister is if you can't not. And I think, that's what a call is, and it's a pretty interesting, it's a pretty interesting vocation, this wise and wondrous calling, So, let me say that we are a faith tradition that is an association of congregations. We don't have a hierarchy of within the tradition, and so every congregation is autonomous and makes its own decisions. So while it's possible for a congregation to call a minister who falls outside of the kind of guidelines for ministry, there are also shared guidelines for what's expected of ministers. And if someone wants to be a Unitarian Universalist minister who is fellowshipped by the Unitarian Universalist Association, there are things that you must do. And not unlike other traditions, there are committees that you need to pass and talk to. You need to have the education, which primarily means a Master's of Divinity, and go through also mentoring process for that after you've met the first real hurdle in terms of being fellowship, that you have at least another 3 renewals or processes of renewal that you're have to present to a board. And so it's maybe similar to most faith traditions.
And so when you're talking about the training and the Master of Divinity, how does that look? I mean, are you intentionally required to look at a wide variety of traditions? Is there focus on different texts? How does that occur? Because like you said, you're looking at this huge range.
Right.
How do you make that manageable in 3 years, 4 years? 5 years, is it 6 years? I mean, because there's so much to get under your belt.
One thing I forgot to mention is that we are required to do an internship. So there's also that piece of the training that's where you're working, sometimes mostly in a congregation, but there are alternative ways of people doing internships if they're going to serve the community in different ways. I decided to do a year of postgraduate just for my own purposes, but most people do their seminary training in 3 years to get their Master's of Divinity plus the year of internship. But yes, there is a list of competencies that a minister must meet when they're talking to this committee. And so that you have to have some proof of having studied world religions in different ways. And you have to have taken, UU history courses and UU polity courses. And I happened to go to a seminary that was in a consortium where there was also a UU seminary. And so I was able to take my classes there, but many of my colleagues have, gone to non-UU seminaries and taken their UU courses online or one-on-one with people, or, in whatever ways they could get those outside of wherever they were attending seminary.
Right. So starting to think, we've hit on the training, we've talked about the worship service. One other key aspect from my perspective is, what are other activities? You talked about education, but what are other activities that we would normally see at a Unitarian Universalist congregation, or maybe think more specifically at Unitarian Universalist West? What kind of regular activities are going on there among the congregation?
I was kind of struck earlier when you said something about how, when we were talking about the Bible and the newspaper, that how you started with, I can't remember quite how you said it, but that how your faith has to be informed by the outside world. And at least for me, and of course I can't speak for every Unitarian Universalist because we're not the same, but at least for me, I see it a little differently, that we take our lived experience and then look for meaning in it. So it's almost as if you're starting with the newspaper and then saying, oh my gosh, this is the world. What can this possibly mean? Or what do I do with this? How do I understand it? How do I find my purpose here? And so a lot of our things, I would say a lot of what we do is that kind of questioning and engagement through education, through public events, through social justice activities, through serving the world in whatever way we can find to do it, but also, I think, in advocacy for things that support our values. So, for example, a few weeks ago, we had a banned book story hour, because many of the books that have been banned for children in schools are about not wanting children to be exposed to difference, whether that be gender or sexuality or faith, or disability, whatever it is, that some of those banned books are just saying, I don't want my kids exposed to that. And we believe that all people have inherent worth and dignity, and so we want our children to know and love difference in people, and to know that they are loved for who they are and belong in the world because of who they are. And so something like that banned book story hour is the kind of thing that we would do. Or we can put them under the social justice rubric, but advocacy for different groups, for trying to be allies and or support for organizations that are struggling in ways that we might not. As you might assume, a congregation in Brookfield is relatively white and relatively privileged, and it's a challenge to move beyond that pretty egocentric view of the world. So that's the kinds of things we do, is to expand ourselves.
So you've talked about, the banned book story hour. What are other, earlier you said that anti-racism was key to the identity of one of the principles. How does that get expressed in Unitarian Universalist West?
We talk about it a lot. We're trying to educate ourselves. We have an anti-racism transformation team that's looking at our system, our structures, our systems in the congregation, our documents, everything from our bylaws to our policies, to look for ways in which that we are being complicit with a white supremacist culture. White supremacy culture, I should say. And then we try very hard to find ways to, as I say, expand ourselves, to get proximate to we work with both Micah and Sophia, which are interfaith social justice collaboratives in Waukesha County and in Milwaukee, and to just learn and expand ourselves, and to find our biggest work, I think, as a white person, is learning to understand myself as someone who's immersed in a culture that is racist, and so that's huge work for us to do. We talk about it in our services. We try to lift it up. But not as ways to say we're bad or we're wrong, but rather to acknowledge the systems around us, and to find and to accept our own agency in changing that. And because if we don't know that we're doing it, we don't change anything, right? So.
I know that you've only been with this congregation for 6 months. But in that time, what have you noticed about the ways that the congregation helps to create and foster a sense of shared identity? What are ways that that you guys, you folks, work together to see that, hey, we are united here. We're a group. What are things that help bring that unity together?
Pastor Will gave me a list of questions he thought he was going to ask me, and I find this to be the most difficult one. And I don't know why exactly, so I've been trying to think, well, where does that question come from? Like, what's the background that would help me understand what it means to have an identity as a congregation? I think we have an identity as a congregation, as a community, just in focusing on our belonging to and with one another and with all that is. And people find a language or an attitude or a way of being that feels different to them from some other place, that it feels like home to them. And part of that is that willingness to challenge ourselves, to ask big questions, to not try to put things in boxes. I don't know that there are specific activities. I wonder sometimes about other traditions of what makes someone feel like they identify as that. And I suppose some of it is growing up in a tradition. You just get used to how it is, and you know what the words are, you know what to say, you know when to stand, when to sit, when to kneel, when to, do whatever it is. And that's probably true for us too, that it gets comfortable, it gets to be the way that you understand. It's not unusual for people to say to me, I love this place because of that we were able to do that together, do that thing together, whatever it is, that conversation, that and I think, well, isn't it that way everywhere, that people, have some connection? I suppose you make friends, you have connections, you find your place, you know that you're the one who likes to greet or make the coffee or, do whatever it is, and you identify then with that group, and it's your identity. But is there something about that question that you wonder, like, how would it be different than somewhere else? Or
I mean, it's one of the questions I've been asking across the board, because each individual congregation has a persona.
yeah,
Each individual congregation has things that they do
yeah,
that helps to say, well, this is how we are together. And so I'm just curious. That was one of those things. Of how does a Lutheran church here in Brookfield, what do they do that helps make them feel like, well, we are Brookfield Lutheran versus another Calvary Lutheran, or what are some of those defining marks that help?
I don't
help
think
us
we even
understand?
try that.
Okay.
Because I think that we're not so prevalent that people have 4 different Unitarian Universalist churches they might go to, or congregations they might go to choose between the two. And so I think our identity more is as Unitarian Universalists, not as from UU Church West. And frankly, I also think one way that people identify as having a faith community that's not specifically Christian, that works for them, that for something about their background or their understanding of Christianity didn't work for them, doesn't appeal to them, and yet they want the community. Does that help?
Absolutely. I mean, and I didn't have any, well,
Yeah.
here's the set answer, but it was more just, to understand a particular congregation, a particular group of people. What helps to foster that shared, cohesive identity? Because we all, every community has to have something that is an organizing principle.
Well, if I understand it right, the history of this particular congregation is that they were a growth initiative of the Unitarian Church in downtown Milwaukee. And so there were enough people living in this area who were going into Milwaukee, and that church has been large and full for a long time, and so they decided to essentially have a church plant out here in Brookfield. I don't think it was specific to be Brookfield. Lots of our members are in Wauwatosa and also Waukesha. I mean, so there's quite a spread of people who come to the congregation. It's not just the neighborhood. But so they do kind of understand themselves as an expansion, somewhere in the historical roots, this kind of expansion out from the city. And that's actually something I suppose we're trying a little bit to overcome in terms of an attitude of being it's not really missionaries, but being the frontier people, going out into the save the world where there's not a Unitarian congregation, but and to be a little bit more humble about where we are and what we can do and who we serve. Yeah, but I do think that's in the church roots a bit, that sense of.
Yeah, and every congregation, from my experience, does have that.
Yeah.
Here are the roots. Here's something that that story continues to percolate, and
Right.
it morphs over the years.
Yeah.
But there's still that seed there.
Right.
And so that
Right.
was just one of the things I was curious about.
Mm-hmm.
So in those 6 months that you've been with this congregation, what are one or two things that have stood out to you that make you proud to be associated with them? What are some of those things that they've done really well that you want to celebrate?
Well, for us, and I think for every congregation, maybe not for this one because you're kind of in-house, right? But I think something that's happened through the COVID experience is that people got out of the habit of getting into community. And whether it's churches or whether it's some other activity out in the world, it became comfortable to stay home, to do things online, to have a different pattern in their lives. And personally, I feel like that's going to be a challenge for our society in general, is to learn how to build community again in maybe better ways, different ways. And one of the things I've really been proud of this congregation is the people who are really showing up and saying, let's look at this and figure out, what we can do or how we can serve, without saying we have to make it just the way it was before. We have to do things just the way we will and people will come, but rather, all right, the world's a little different place. Let's look at what that means for who we are and what we can do, where we're, how we can bloom where we're planted, as they say. And it's also a congregation that, because of a change in ministry, they had the minister who left was with them for 18 years, I think. And so because of a minister who'd left, there's upheaval and change, and especially, again, during COVID, and their willingness to kind of find their legs and keep going. I really have appreciated just the people that I'm working with, and the different kind of programming and things that we're trying to offer to make possible. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, friends, we have about 10 minutes left, and so it's open for whatever questions you have. One thing that I do ask is that we reiterate, we sort of paraphrase back the question so that folks on 966 can hear, and also it just makes it easier for everyone to be on the same page. Art?
Boy, that's a big question. Thank you. So he asked if Unitarians believe in salvation and how do they attain it. There was a huge debate I suppose it was the early mid-1800s within the Universalist church about whether people were saved immediately or whether they were sent to hell and then were saved later. If you want to believe that everyone's saved, is there no punishment? We've really evolved away from thinking about really the afterlife. I think that whatever it is, and this is me personally saying, I'm not saying every Unitarian believes this, but we don't focus on um, a time and place that we don't know or understand. We really look at how we can live our lives as best possible, how it's possible to be good without that sense of whether or not you're saved. We're saved from the beginning, we believe. Everybody is born saved. And so the focus is not on what happens after this life, but on what you do and who you are in this life. And what happens after, we don't know. So it could be that we're saved, that we need to be saved. It could be that there's nothing. I don't know.
Yes.
Right. So the question was, would people who don't believe in God be comfortable in a Unitarian church? Find a place? Yes, I would actually say that people who are more theist might be uncomfortable because there's not as much language. There's not much language often around God or in that way. It's not that it's not okay, for sure, but it's just not the center, I would say, of the faith to talk about God in that way. Often, if we talk about God, it's as a paragraph, not, there's the God, or what some might call mystery, or what some, so it's not God as a known entity. Yeah.
Art?
Most Sundays, the question was whether or not I give a sermon, and most Sundays, yes. Sometimes we do a different format for different reasons, if we want there to be some other conversation or some ritual or something, but most times there's a sermon, yes. It's based on, you mean as in what the... Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Yes, certainly the sermon is based on the principles. It's also based on inspiration from a number of sources. So that might come from nature, it might come from science, it might come from another world religion, it might come from Zoroastrianism, for all, if that's the thing that the inspiration is coming from for the day. But it's an exploration of a lot of possible ways of being the best people that we can be in the world. Okay. My last sermon was about, because it was on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, because last Sunday we had the Imbolc ritual, and yeah, I did talk about seeds and beginnings, and I had a short homily in that service, and so it was about appreciating the seeds that are within us and within the world everywhere and all the possibilities that they have. The Sunday before that, we had a guest speaker, and then Martin Luther King Day, I talked about what was at the center of beloved community. Like, what did Martin Luther King Jr. think beloved community really was? Looking at his theology and his beliefs about how beloved community is created. So, does that help? Yeah.
Right?
Just for argument information, if you want to listen to one of their sermons or see one of their sermons, they are online.
Yes, they are.
They're on their webpage.
Yep. Yep.
And so is it uucw.org?
.org.
If you go there, you can actually see previous services that are recorded.
Yep.
What other questions do you have? Carol?
Mhm. Um, I wouldn't put it in those words, but I understand what you're saying. She said that it sounded to her like our congregation was a catch-all of people with a lot of different beliefs who don't want to be tied down by rules. Is that what you said? Yeah. I guess I really haven't thought about it as rules ever, about rules or lack of rules. I think it's about beliefs, one-way beliefs, rather than. So a person might, hopefully, has a very strong, disciplined faith life, but it's their own. So within the community, there's not an expectation that everyone would have the same faith life. And that joy in the merging of and the openness of openness to others. It's kind of rare. There are people who, I mean, we kind of joke about, Unitarians or whatever it might be, that there are people who identify as Jewish and Unitarian, just as there are people who identify as Christian and Unitarian, or people who identify as Buddhist and Unitarian, or pagan and Unitarian, but they come together because of that Unitarian Universalist piece, which is about that deep appreciation for being in a space where it's not rules, it's limits. It's the ability to have doubts and questions. It's the openness to exploration. It's, and I know several faith traditions or Christian traditions talk about revelation not being sealed. And that's true for us too, that there's an unknown shore of truth and understanding that most of us have not yet traveled. And just being open to that's there, that possibility is there. Does that help at all?
And I
Yeah.
think, Carol, one of the things that I heard in your question was this idea that, well, it's just sort of this catch-all, but I think that there's still a unifying push for Unitarian Universalists that we are guided to find and seek spiritual nourishment, and that occurs in community. So instead of having things be, one way of belief, it's that we're trying to experience the transcendent, the divine, whatever word is most useful. And we find that together with others who are finding that exploration meaningful is helpful. Is that an okay way to put it?
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. That the reason we come together is not because we all believe the same thing. We come together because we all want to be on that search and believe that the more exposure and openness to difference, the more rich our search will be.
Carol?
Historically, Unitarians believe in one God. I would say that as a tradition now, oneness is more of an answer than God. So whether God's included in that oneness, that's up to the individual, of course, but that the oneness of everything, or the interdependent web of all being, or all that is, the great mystery, that there's a oneness in it that humanity's included in, but there's more than that. Yes, Unitarian as a word comes from that theological debate about one God or a Trinity, which is also part of how Unitarianism diverged from Christianity, because Jesus is seen as a great teacher, leader, but not divine in any way more than any of the rest of us.
So, not part of a Godhead, so to speak. So, now I've lost my train of thought. Anyway, does that, yeah.
Patty, you had something. It,
One of my congregants once years ago said that our hymnal was our Bible, and I kind of think that's true because there's a big collection of readings in the back, but the readings come from a lot of different sources. I mean, they're kind of divided into the sources of our Jewish and Christian heritage and our personal experience, and so that no, we do not have a sacred text that's one thing in any one place. Mhm.
Patty and them, unfortunately, will have to call it good. No.
Mhm. Yes, of course, we have celebration to all the different rites of passage that, not all of them, but we have our own rites of passage, whether beginning with child dedication